All right, well, good evening. Had to go into the old memory bank there a little bit. Almost had a headache trying to remember all those words, but appreciate that song. I do, one of the things about the hymns that I appreciate is that they're memorable in the sense that a lot of them were at least written in a way where we can remember them. And even on an occasion like this, sing them without having words in front of us. If you have a Bible, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians 7. There should be a presentation that is not that one, but yeah, maybe. Trying to remember. Anyway, if we don't have the PowerPoint outline, we'll survive. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 tonight, and this is a chapter of chapters. As I said last time, I didn't have adequate time to work on it that day and didn't want to just kind of stumble through it. What I would like to do, though, is look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in its entirety. I don't want to discourage you. There are 40 verses. That means we're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on each verse, but I think to try to get the sense of what Paul is saying here to the church at Corinth, it'll be helpful to us. I'm not sure that's it either, but it should be Marriage Matters. There we go. All right. I just didn't change the title slide. We're gonna look at some things that Paul has to say about marriage, and I want to say a couple of things from the beginning. We shouldn't necessarily approach 1 Corinthians chapter 7 thinking that this is all the biblical instruction concerning marriage. We need to approach 1 Corinthians chapter 7 understanding that Paul is answering some questions that had been sent to him. It appears to be in a letter. If we look just at verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the things whereof he wrote unto me." And what we're going to do is get into a section where Paul is going to begin to answer some different questions that the believers at Corinth had. And so, one of the challenges when it comes to understanding 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is we don't necessarily have the questions that Paul was asked. What we have are the answers that Paul gave. And so as we make our way through this, what we're going to do is we're going to basically look at three different questions. And I stumbled across a commentator who kind of summarized each section by one of these questions. And it's probably not the exact question that was posed to Paul, but it kind of gets at the idea of what Paul is dealing with as he answers. So I don't have a lot of introduction, but I just wanted to say that. I want to just begin by reading 1 Corinthians chapter 7. You can follow along. We'll read down through at least verse 9. The Bible says, "Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch celibacy within religion, and really this is an idea of you've made it to the next level in your religious faith by refraining from this kind of activity. And this seems to be what Paul is dealing with in regards to the division that is here in the church. In verse 1, he says, it is good for a man not to touch, and we recognize that word, that's a euphemism for having a sexual relationship with a woman. He said it is good, okay? And I want to just pause for a moment and recognize that he said it is good. He did not say it is law binding or binding by the law. He did not say it is necessary, but what he's basically saying is this is an acceptable thing. But he goes on in verse 2 very quickly, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. I think what we're going to see here is basically Paul is appealing to this idea that it's not necessarily right or wrong, or there's not one standard for every believer. And we're going to get to this in a moment, but I believe ultimately that what it has to do with is God. I don't want to fall into the idea what's true for me might not be true for you, but we understand that when it comes to God's specific will for our life, that God has a different plan for us. And being presented with this idea that believers were supposed to refrain from marriage, Paul is really presenting both sides of the coin. There are clear advantages to being single, and I say that as a married man. And my wife is in the nursery, okay? There are clear advantages to being single when it comes to the service of God, and we're going to look at some of those things here tonight. There are obviously clear advantages to being married, and we even recognize that in the beginning, as a part of God's creative order, that he set these things into motion. So he's not condemning celibacy or requiring celibacy. What he's saying is that it is a good thing, and for some, it would be possible to follow God and remain single and unmarried. And for some, it would be possible for them to be married, obviously, and follow the will of God. Now, one of the things that, and you may not have thought through this, but in studying through this, I was reminded that most people believe that the Apostle Paul was actually, at one time, a married man, okay? He was, by most scholars, you can go to Acts chapter 26 and verse 10, we won't turn there, but he was likely a part of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was made up of 70 men, and in order to be on the Jewish Sanhedrin, you had to be a married man. It was also just, as we've already said, this idea that except for extreme circumstances, they would believe that most men that were Jewish would be married by the time that they're 20. What is also true is, though, that it is clear that at this point, as Paul writes this letter, he is no longer a married man. And so the question is, what happened to the Apostle Paul's wife? Well, I'm pretty confident that he did not divorce her. It could be true that she left him after his Damascus road as a single man who was likely married at one point. Paul has a pretty good understanding of again, both sides of this coin. Let's move on to verses 3 through 5. And he speaks of the marriage in the relationship to the idea of celibacy or abstinence within the marriage. Okay, so first of all, there's this idea. Is it lawful or is it good for someone to be married in this way? But secondly, there was also this idea that even those who are married, that they should refrain from being intimate one with another in order that they might give themselves completely to the Lord. Well, let's listen to what Paul says. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. And verses, as we continue down here, and we won't read this again, we just read through this. What Paul is arguing here is that when it comes to marriage, what you have, and I say this often in premarital counseling, the world has this idea that two people are coming together in marriage, and if the husband gives 50% and the wife gives 50%, that they're going to have 100% in this marriage. that is not a good picture of what marriage is. No, a good picture of what marriage is that the husband gives himself wholly to his wife, and his wife gives herself wholly to the husband. They are giving themselves away in that sense when it comes to marriage. And so this idea that they would abstain from this kind of physical relationship in order that they might give themselves wholly to God, Paul is going to argue, hey, listen, this is actually nonsense. Apart from, there may be a season in your marriage, and this would be done with consent from both parties. There may be a season in your marriage, and it appears to be a pretty extreme thing where you're going to refrain from being intimate with each other so that you can give yourselves, did you notice what he said, to fasting and to prayer. This is not to be done for long, and you should come together again. And his argument is interesting, and I think it's practical and clear. He says that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. Paul makes it abundantly clear that except for a brief time, that a husband and a wife are to refrain from this idea of abstinence or celibacy in the marriage, again, as long as their bodies would allow. He goes on in verse 6 and says, but I speak by permission and not of commandment. Okay, verse 7, for I would that all men were even as I myself. Paul, in verse 7, he's not arguing or exhorting or calling for these believers to be single as he was at this point in his life, but he is arguing that there is a benefit. He is arguing that those who are not married at this point and were considering marriage, the unmarried and the widow, and we're going to see, I think, by the time we get to the end of this chapter, likely what Paul has in mind, or who Paul has in mind when he says the unmarried and the widow, both of them being people who at one point had been married. The unmarried being those who had either their spouse had left them, they'd have been involved in a divorce or something of that nature. And the widow, obviously we recognize that person's spouse has passed away. And in speaking to them, he says, for I would that all men were as I myself. There's a lot going on here. And I want to say this. Marriage, and I think we can recognize this, and maybe this would be a good moment to stop and ask if there's any questions or comments. I want to make this statement, and I cleared this with my wife. Okay? I called her this afternoon and I said, I'm going to say this in church. Are you okay with this? She was. Marriage is both a blessing and a burden. Okay? Marriage is both a blessing and a burden. It comes with great reward, but it also entails great responsibility. When a person enters into marriage, he or she is no longer living according to what they think is right or what is best or good or what they desire. But again, Paul makes it clear here they have a responsibility to the other person. We recognize from Scripture that in marriage, both parties have God-given roles that are also good, but they involve a great deal of sacrifice. Okay? I think the key to all of this really is in verse 7 as we continue on. He says, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. Let's pause here for just a moment. Paul is arguing, again, both sides of the coin. He's presenting some things to these believers in Corinth, likely answering a question that deals with this idea of celibacy, which, by the way, has crept into many religions, right? We recognize this in the Catholic Church, the idea of celibacy and those things. But Paul is not requiring this for sure. And I would even argue when we get to the pastoral letters, right, a part of the qualification deals with the pastor's wife, right? And so we recognize that Paul is not instituting a law here. But why do you think Paul at this point in his life found that there was a benefit to being single in the place that he was? Daryl. Okay, he lived solely for Christ. And how did that play out in the Apostle Paul's life? in prison a lot. We look at Paul's missionary journeys, right? It's hard to imagine Paul accomplishing all that he did in that sense and having a wife and children at home and leaving them behind for all of these long periods of time. It would be hard to, in that sense, do both of those things. Okay? Someone else. Jeremy. For sure. For sure. Yeah, and I think, and one of the things I want to make abundantly clear, I am pro-marriage, okay? I think it is a good thing. I think God has ordained this. But when he gets to this idea, but every man hath his proper gift of God, I think what Paul is dealing with here is that God has a will for some people to be single, and God has a will for some people to be married. And I think that one of the things that we often fail to recognize in these things, or someone may fail to, there's not a lot of people here tonight considering this idea of marriage or getting married, a lot of people who are married. This idea of if I get married, if I give myself to this person wholeheartedly, how will this affect my ability? Will this enhance my ability to serve the Lord, or will this detract from that? So I think some of these kinds of things are what is going on in Paul's mind. Paul believed that it was not ultimately up to the individual Christian as much as it was to the will or the plan of God. Any other thoughts or questions before we go on to verses 8 and 9? All right, verse 8. I say, therefore, to the unmarried, and again, I'm taking this to be those who had been married but were no longer, by way of separation, or to the widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But then he says in verse 9, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. If God gives the believer with the gift of singleness, it is better for them to stay in their lane. I know that, as we try to unpack what's going on here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, one of the things that we don't have right in front of us is the culture of their day. But I know the culture of our day, that there are lots of ideas or assumptions or misnomers about people who are single. We maybe even have been single. Well, we all were single at one point in our life, right? I should say that. Maybe there was some nerves and apprehension about, I wonder if I'm ever going to find someone. All of those things. I think one of the things that we should take away from this is it doesn't so much matter what society thinks about the position of singleness or being married, but rather, what does God say? What does God have for me? I think God really, I think that he really wanted God's specific will for their lives to inform them rather than the cultural expectations. And I would say this, both inside and outside of the church. If they cannot contain themselves, if not being married is going to be a problem for them when it comes to this idea of sexuality, then it is better for them to marry than to burn. All right. Any thoughts, questions, comments? We maybe have some study Bibles here that are going to give us some. Yeah.
Here with burn.
That's how it does. Yes. Here.
Okay.
What do you have?
So home standard says to burn with desire.
Okay. Yeah. So speaking to that point, right? Yeah. 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 It is not to burn in hell. Okay. It is to burn with desire. Thank you for that clarification. Jake. Yeah.
To figure out whether or not they need to get married or not.
Yeah.
Even in churches or whatever micro cultures we find people growing up in, we should be able to God's word.
Yeah.
God does have the individual plan for people's lives, and
Yeah.
a lot of it just comes to recognizing that and seeking his will.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that we want to say, we want to put forth as we think about marriage, you can have this burning with desire, right, to be married, and rush into some kind of relationship that you think is going to meet all of your needs, but if it is not God's will for you, what you're going to find is that you're going to be wholly discontented. One of the things that I challenge, and I think we're going to get to this here, Lord willing, one of the things that God desires for all of us is that we would be content where we are. Right? We're going to get down to verse number 17, and this idea of being content or prospering or bloom where you're planted, this idea of being all in where God has you at the moment in your service to Him. We need to make sure that we're considering those things when it comes to a great decision like this, right? Yeah. Anyone else? Pastor Herb.
I saw somewhere that the culture in this article noticed that people aren't dating anymore.
Yeah.
It's going to the intimate part
Yeah.
without hardly knowing the person's name.
Yeah. 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 And you look at the breakdown of our society, of our culture, however you want to look at that. It used to be that people were at least dating and involved in a inappropriate relationship, but now they're just looking for that gratification, that benefit that they can get, and then to move on. But again, this is not God's desire, right? One of the things that Paul has dealt with extensively in 1 Corinthians up to this point is the idea of purity, right? Remaining pure. And so one of the things I think we can take away from these first 9 verses as well, whether you find yourself in this season of life, married or unmarried, God's desire for you is to remain pure in whatever place you find yourself in. Anyone else? All right, let's move on. Question number 2, and this is just kind of the generalized question that we're looking at. Again, not claiming this is the exact question. Should these Christian believers who are married stay married? Okay? Now again, thinking about the culture, thinking of the makeup of the church at Corinth, it is likely that there were those who in the church at Corinth got married. They were married before they were saved, right? There were those who may have been one spouse married, one spouse not. We're going to even see that there are some who are likely a part of this church that were slaves. And I was doing some studying and reading. And in the Roman society at this point, there were at least 4 different views on what it meant to be married. And anyway, we're not going to go down that rabbit trail. And so Paul, I think he's really trying to deal with this idea. Should Christians who are married stay married? Now, before we go through any of this, what do you think would maybe be some of the reasoning of these believers as to why they should separate from their spouse? I haven't given you enough to maybe answer that adequately. Stephanie? Yeah, okay. And that could obviously cause great conflict, right? If the spouse is not a believer. And this is why I think the biblical counsel on marriage for a believer is to only marry a believer. And yet we recognize that there are times when someone becomes a believer and their spouse does not, right? And so that can cause great conflict. Someone else? Anyone else? I think that we're going to see some of this as we go through this, but this idea that being in a marriage relationship with an unbeliever would basically make them impure, right? That if they were connected, if they were one flesh with an unbeliever, that this would again hinder them from serving the Lord. And one of the things I want to say as Paul is dealing with these questions, he doesn't seem to be doing this in a harsh tone or a harsh attitude. I think he is trying to pastor these people who have legitimate questions about wanting to do what God wants them to do. So let's continue on. Verse 10. He speaks, first of all, I think just to the nature, the covenantal aspect of marriage. He says, "And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband." Again, if some of these Corinthian believers were beginning to think that their marriage was hindering them from serving the Lord, maybe there was, an unsaved spouse or an uncommitted Christian in a marriage relationship, so in dissolving their existing marriage, that they may be better off. And Paul's basic command to them is, God says no. And I think it's good for us to remind ourselves that are here tonight, married or unmarried, that God's God's design for marriage is one man and one woman for life. We'll stop there. Then in verse 11, he speaks again to this idea of divorce. And while the Bible does give, at least from my perspective, two exemptions, two reasons why a believer could get a divorce and remarry. Anyone know what those are? What's that? Yeah, unfaithfulness, so adultery, we recognize this. And I want to say, the Bible does not prescribe this as the answer for a situation like that. There can be healing, there can be hope, even when a marriage covenant has been compromised. But it is permissible, at least from my take on God's Word. The other one is a clear one, and we're going to see this, is abandonment, right? Especially by an unbeliever. So what we want to get, though, is a picture that what God desires is that marriage would last until death do us part. Jesus speaks of this issue in Matthew 5 and verse 31. He says, "It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery." God is clear. This is strong language concerning this idea of marriage. He says in verse 11, "But if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife." For those who had been divorced for an unbiblical reason, there is grace, but they were to remain unmarried. That's what Paul is making clear here. One thing that I would just say again to those of us that are here, maybe you're watching online, our culture and our society wants to present divorce as an easy way out of a difficult situation, as a better option than what you have by staying in a marriage. And I want to just make it clear that with my involvement in counseling married couples and unfortunately seeing divorces take place, divorce is not an easy way out. It's not it's not just a convenient sidestep to a plan that you once had. No, we're not to view it in this way. Verse 12, he says, "But to the rest speak I, not the Lord." And I want to just clarify the beginning of verse 12. What Paul is not saying is that this is no longer inspired, so just take this as some opinion of Paul. But he's saying Jesus hasn't spoken specifically about this, okay? This is still, though, the inspired word of God. "But to the rest, speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, not saved." I want to make that clear. There is no guarantee that an unbelieving spouse will be saved. "And the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart," notice this, "let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace." Verse 16, "For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife?" So he now deals with a case of a believer being married to an unbeliever. And he argues that even though it is not ideal, it again is not a cause for divorce. His argument is that God can use the believing spouse to influence. God can use the believing spouse to make the home at least godly as much as they can. If the unbelieving spouse wants to depart, he says this is permissible and that the believing spouse is bound no longer, but this should not be the will or the desire of the believing spouse. Imagine in the church at Corinth, an unsaved man married to a woman who has trusted Christ as her Savior, And so all of a sudden she's going to, she thinks that her life would be better off. She could serve the Lord more wholly and completely. She knows she can't divorce her husband, but she may be able to drive him away, okay? That's not what Paul has in mind. This is not a strategy 101 for how to lose your spouse, okay? But he recognizes that these were real situations that were taking place. These were real circumstances that this church was working through. All right, let me stop there for a quick moment. Any other thoughts or questions or clarifications before we move on to verse 17? We're moving fast, but again, we're trying to make it to verse 40. Yes?
This might have been more prevalent back then because it was earlier in the church history.
Yeah.
There were people getting saved.
Well, exactly.
It's not as much that way today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just kind of push back a little bit on that. It's not so much for that probably in an established church. But you think about some places around the world where churches are being started. You think about a missionary going to a foreign country that is not America and doesn't have an American view on marriage, how you even deal with these things. What Paul, I think one of the main things that he wants to get at is when the gospel comes to Corinth and the gospel comes to the lives of these believers, we'll get to this a little bit more, but there are certain things that the gospel is not just going to break up, right? It's not to dissolve relationships that are already there. He's not trying to cause a bunch of separations for those who are already married. No, it is God's will that they would stay married, and it would be a benefit to them. Any other thoughts or questions? Verse 17. Here we go. But God, as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk. Okay? Now, what do you think he means by that? Really speaking to what we were just talking about. As the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk. Yeah, be content with what you have or where you're at, and I think even specifically to this idea of being married to an unsaved spouse, right? God can work wonders in situations like that. We've probably all heard of scenarios where God has used a believing spouse to lead the other spouse to the Lord. As the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk. He gives us a couple of illustrations to bring home this point that these believers should stay and be content that God can use them where they are. Whether they were married, single, divorced, widowed, remarried, or whatever the case may be. You see, one of the takeaways for me in my study, is that ultimately it's not whether or not I'm married or single that gives me the ability to serve God. No, it's whether I'm single or married, having the right heart and a right desire to serve the Lord. It's not key. The marriage status is not key. So to this point, verse 17, as the Lord hath called everyone, or how you were when you were saved, okay, not that God isn't going to change our lives. We know that He does. But there are some things that we can't change just because we have gotten saved. He gives a couple illustrations. The first one is circumcision. The second one, beginning in verse 20, is slavery. Let's read down through. He said, is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Right? Again, this is speaking to the idea that there was often division in the church between the Jew and the Gentile. There was often a view of superiority for the Jewish people, and we could go to the book of Galatians, they're even demanding that Christians who were not Jewish people, that they would get circumcised, men, in order that they could become a Christian. He makes it clear, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. I want to challenge each of us here tonight to obey the Word of God to our fullest capacity wherever we find ourselves at. To obey the Word of God wherever we find ourselves to the fullest capacity. So circumcision, example 1, slavery, number 2. Verse 20, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. And we know, I remember preaching through the book of Ephesians, and what we have is a picture that's painted where there would have likely even have been slaves and slave masters in the same church. Verse 21, art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, notice this, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called, being free, is Christ's servant. You're bought with a price. A nod back to chapter 6, the end of chapter 6. You're bought with a price. Be ye not the servants of men. And then verse 24, brethren, let every man, wherein he is called, therein abide with God. Every believer is to be a servant of Christ. And these believers were called to be the best Christian that they could be in the circumstances that they were in. Any other thoughts or questions or comments so far? Yeah, exactly. And I want to, we get into some of that, and man, first of all, when we hear slavery, I hope that we have a negative response, right? The second thing I want to say is when we hear slavery, what we generally think of is slavery that happened in America, and we would recognize that that is wrong. What we must also recognize is that slavery has been a part of humanity since the existence of humanity. God's people were slaves in Egypt, right? This was a part of the Roman culture. And so Paul, to your point, Paul at times calls a person who is saved and yet finds himself in this position of being a slave to be light in the darkness, to be salt, right, in the world that they were living in. It's hard for us sometimes to think through those things. But again, God is calling, Paul is calling for these believers to abide where they are and be servants of Christ. Did you have your hand up, Pastor Herb? All right. What's that? Not any longer. Yes. So it was at one point, but this is a new covenant. So that's where the difference is made. Yep. Good point, though, because it was. Anyone else? All right. Number 3. Should the Corinthian believers who had never been married, and he's going to speak of virgins in here, should they get married? Well, what does he say? Now, concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. Again, Jesus had not given previous revelation on the matter in regards to the context that they're in. Notice what he says, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. One of the things that I think we should just point out here is Paul is an apostle. Paul has been given a specific and special privilege as he is authoring the New Testament, or at least part of that. Verse 26, I suppose, therefore, that it is good for the present distress. Okay? Take note of that. And remember, we're trying to think about this in the context of Paul's day, in the context of the church at Corinth. I suppose, therefore, that it is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. All right. In the context of what is going on, I spent time trying to research this. What is this present distress? Anyone want to take a stab at what Paul's referring to? The present distress. What do we got going on back here? I think we might have to investigate. We're having some unruly students over here. My parents and the Madigans. Anyway, we'll just move along. Any idea what the present distress might have been for the church at Corinth, first century church?
Fierce persecution.
Yeah, so fierce persecution, right? Nero's ramping up, and we know throughout church history how Christians suffered. Going through 1 Peter, we recognize the suffering that Peter is talking about. And so it's likely that it could have been, at least in part, persecution. There's also a great famine that went through at this time. I tend to think he's dealing more with the spiritual side of things than just a generalized famine in the land. But in regards to that, he makes some things abundantly clear, right? I suppose, therefore, that it is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man to be so. Again, whatever place they found them in, to stay in that place. For those who were single, his charge was to stay that way. And for those who were married, they too should stay in that way. Verse 29 through 31, let me read that. There's two phrases that stand out in here. I want you to notice the phrase, the time is short, and then he says, for the fashion of this world passeth away. Let's look at those. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, it remaineth, that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world, not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. What Paul is wanting them to keep in mind in regards to this question again, and this is in regards to the virgins getting married, right? Those who had not been married yet, moving forward and married. He wants them to approach this with their eyes wide open. He wants them to recognize, and he uses some interesting hyperbolic language here in verse 30, not to invest everything in this life. He wants them to recognize that there is more to our lives than just this life. He says, the time is short. The time is short. And then verse 31, and that they use this world not as not abusing it. How would they abuse the world? By investing all that they had into this life. By trying to get all that they could out of this life. By thinking about their life as a Christian only in light of this life. We believe in eternity. I want you to think about this. Well, let me ask you, do you believe in eternity? All right. We believe in eternity, but how many of us often find ourselves living as though this life is the only life? I want to be careful. I don't think Scooter will watch our online service here tonight. Tomorrow, flying out, going to the funeral on Friday, and I'm just thinking a lot about him and, the passing of Leslie. And to be honest with you, I just have some real questions, right? They're serving the Lord faithfully there. God is using them in incredible ways. The church they established, all of these things, and it just doesn't make sense to me. And then it's like, I begin to think about, they just had their first grandchild. Think about their 2 children that are left behind and all of these things. And I recognize and I believe in the sovereignty of God, that He's in control. He's either caused it or allowed it. They're the only 2 biblical options that I see. And I found myself feeling sorry for Leslie. But I want to tell you that I think I'm actually thinking in an unbiblical way. I want to be careful how I say this. I love my family, but what awaits us in the life to come, we're not losing out by going to heaven. It's like who in here, imagine going to the DMV and the line's all the way down the hallway, and for some reason they're like, you're in the back of the line, and they're like, oh, Mr. Frost, can you come up here? I'm going to be walking by all of these people, and they're not going to be saying, oh, I feel so bad for you. You're not waiting in this line, and you're not experiencing all the joys that the DMV has to offer. They brought you right to that's probably not a good, we're at the DMV. There's nothing good about it, right? You're waiting to get in line, to get in the park at Disney World, okay? Let's change the illustration. And if you've ever been to Disney World, if you want to be there for the gate drop, you're crazy. And I've been there, and I've done it. Beth stays back, and I go with whoever's willing and brave. But there's a massive amount of people. You know, if all of a sudden you get called all the way up to the front, they're like, okay, you can now enter into Disney World. You don't have to wait through all of this, friends. I'm going to tell you, we're headed to heaven. And what Paul is saying here, what he says by all this hyperbolic language in verse 30, and they that weep as though they weep not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world. It's okay to use this world. It's okay to have a job. It's okay to have money. But if we're living for what this world has to offer, we're missing the point. You say, what on earth does this have to do with these virgins that are in the church at Corinth? If we're viewing marriage in light of all that we're going to get out of marriage in this life, and we're viewing it just because we want companionship, or just because we want this kind of intimate relationship, or just because we don't want to be alone, I want to tell you, we're viewing marriage in the wrong way. There's nothing wrong with some of those things, but those should not be at the top of the list. Is this going to help me serve God? Is this going to help me fulfill God's will for my life? And so he's wanting them to think about marriage with an eternal perspective. Verse 32. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how that he may please his wife. And we know that's proof that Paul was married once. Anyway, all right, there's a couple of laughs, and I'll move on. Verse 34, and he's going to turn it around. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Verse 35. And this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you. Right? Paul understands that it's challenging to decipher God's specific will for our life. Not that I cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend unto the Lord. Notice this, it's interesting, without distraction. What does the Holman have there? Marcus, the end of verse 35.
Yeah, so that you may be devoted to the Lord without distraction.
All right, we're not missing any words this time. No, I'm just joking. Paul calls marriage, in a sense, distracting. Right? Again, I don't want us to look at this and say, well, this is a negative thing and no one should get married. But what we must recognize for those, what they needed to recognize, those who were considering marriage, is if they were going to move forward with getting married, if they were going to change their status on Facebook from single to married or whatever the case might be, they need to recognize that there, again, are great rewards that come with marriage, but great, what did we say earlier, responsibilities. That marriage is an incredible blessing. My wife's in here now, I'm going to still say it, but it is a burden in a sense that I'm no longer just living for myself. I'm no longer just going to go off to Africa on a whim and say I'm going to be a missionary there. No, I have a whole lot of other things to consider. Paul identifies three great differences in the single life, that there are great differences in the single life and the married life. How different things would be if he had a family at this point. Not bad, but different. Still think about the question, should the Corinthian believers who had never been married get married? Now he deals interestingly, and this again has to do with culture. We had an interesting conversation in our home the other day. Our girls, I don't ever remember thinking about marriage or getting married till I was like 17. But little girls, maybe it's just in our home, but little girls think about this, and they're talking about getting married and all this stuff. And I told them, I said, you have to have my permission before you could get married. And they're kind of like, and then Maya, she's like, that's right, you have to ask Mom and Dad. I'm not sure that that's so much a law. I think it's a good practice. If I had to ask Pastor Lake if I could marry his daughter, as intimidating as that was, I think it's a good thing. But culturally, notice what he says, but if any man, and he's speaking now of a father, think that he behaveth himself uncomely towards his virgin or his child is unmarried, if she pass the flower of her age and needs so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not. Let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart, that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage, what does he say? Doeth better. How should a Christian father think about the marriage of his son or daughter? Well, I'll tell you how I think about it as a father. I think Paul's right on. No, they're not getting married, okay? Honestly, though, how should a father think about the marriage of his son or daughter who has never been married? Well, I think in light of present circumstances, they need to consider the will of God. Oh, David Guzik said this. We're almost done. For Paul, the choice, he didn't say we're almost done, I did. He said, for Paul, the choice between married and single was not the choice between good and bad, or I want to say even right or wrong, but better and best. And for Paul, in light of present circumstances, he regarded singleness as best. Marriage, again, is good. God has made that abundantly clear. But it must be approached with wisdom and awareness. And then finally in verses 39 and 40, and we've made it, he circles back around to the widows. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Paul was convinced that his opinion was a godly opinion, that it had come from the influence of God in his life. He reminded the believers who were married that they were bound to their spouse, and it was their obligation, as long as they could, to stay married. For those whose spouses had died, they were free to be married. To a believer, he says, he makes that distinction, the end of verse 39, only in the Lord. But he believed that they would be better suited to serve the Lord as he was in singleness. Wow, that was a lot. I want to sum all of this whole chapter that we just looked at up by looking back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verses 19 and 20. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. I think that for us, again, Paul writing specific questions asked by specific people in specific circumstances. Okay, so what is the takeaway for us? God included this in His Word for us. So what do we take away from this? Well, I think first of all, what we need to do is make sure that every step that we take in our lives, we approach from this mindset, for I am bought with a price. Is this going to help me glorify God? Or will this prohibit me from glorifying God? Questions to ask concerning marriage. This is from Warren Wiersbe. 5 questions. What is my gift from God? What are the 2 options that we saw tonight concerning marriage? What are the 2 options concerning this gift? God gifts some to be what? What's that? Single. And God gifts some to be what? married. And we need to consider, again, God's will for us. Number 2, am I marrying a believer, right? I think this is clear. We need to, this is, Paul makes this clear from the text. He's dealing with the challenge of being married to an unbeliever. He's not presenting that as a, evangelistic dating and marriage that someday, hopefully, if I marry this unbeliever, they'll get saved. No, God would set it forth that we're not to be unequally yoked. Number 3, are the circumstances such that marriage is right now? I would say that God has given all of us the gift of singleness, again, at least for a certain part of our life. And we need to make sure that if we're entering into marriage, that it's right for me and that it's right now. How will marriage affect my service for Christ? Well, you may walk away from tonight saying we're kind of viewing, Paul seems to have a negative view on marriage here. Take the whole of his writing, right? Go to Ephesians when he's talking about Christ and the church. He's presenting this beautiful picture that, of what marriage represents, that we are the bride of Christ. Don't lose heart in that. And I would say this, for me as a believer right now, being married to my wife, I forget, I was talking to someone recently and Beth had done something for them. Beth was checking in on them. Beth, it was actually while she was up in the ER. She was checking in on someone. And they said they just couldn't believe that she was doing that. I said, I know. You have a lot better pastor's wife than you have a pastor. And I think the church keeps me around sometimes because of her. How will marriage affect my service for Christ? In getting married, it ought to be our goal that we would serve God together. I would just give this advice. Maybe if one person believes that they've been called to, let's say, missions, to minister in a foreign field, and this person that you're dating has no desire, has no ambition, and says, I will not, that's probably a clear sign that you too should not get married. You say, well, I don't want to be alone. You may want to be after you get married to the wrong person. 5, am I prepared to enter into this union for life? Till death do us part, right? That's the Christian view of marriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I hope you got something out of this tonight. Hopefully it'll be helpful to you. Any final thoughts or questions as we come to the end of this? All right. Let's turn to a time of prayer.